Jesse stole the umbrellas from your backpack. You forgot to put it back before you left, so he handed it to David. Because David has all the stuff that
Joke's on him. I planned on throwing it away that night because it broke.
Hey, we have
I'm in one class, and we have had one
He's
assignment.
gotta stop stealing my stuff, though.
We're getting a second one. So, yeah.
He needs a wallet, phone.
Well, I work also, so it's like, that's a good deal for me, at least.
Yeah, I think you're good.
I still have
last time as well.
bare minimum.
I believe not by you.
I thought it an elective
Depending
not
on
to say
what
it.
class it looks
And
like.
then David
and
said
then
it.
it might also be in the spring.
So apparently it's okay to say it.
Availability is always the big question.
Yeah.
You said you were working some as well?
Yeah. I do like 25 hours a week.
You're working contributing.
Andy, how you doing?
Statistics.
All right. What do you do?
Software a little tired.
Yeah.
What do you by those people?
I would work for statistics for something.
It was
But
a
he
lot
was
of
also-
It was yes, stuff you were doing.
It's
All right.
nothing.
Mine will go down next week.
Over this one.
Yeah, it's good. Sorry, you have a big assignment.
I know.
The biggest, yeah. Let's go ahead and start.
It's really good for that. One of my classes, this was referenced like a half period class.
That was so funny watching you figure it out.
They don't squeak regularly enough.
Was that the starting squeak?
They don't squeak regularly enough. Like you can't. Hey, let's go ahead and start.
More than once, he's just squeaked someone's house. Yeah. Got in the car and driven off with it.
So I correct that.
That's the thing I love most about this
Probably.
is that when it's harmless, he takes the joke too far.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that Jesse alone is like entirely Wayne's system.
Okay, guys, welcome. I'm just going to remind everybody of Res Fair next Tuesday, 11 to 3, which is going to be a fun time. Come and answer or suggest objections to Christianity at our booth, and then learn about the other groups that are also Christian that will be around there, and that's always just a fun time to celebrate the resurrection together and everything. Alan is our hero of filling in for people. And so we're going to talk about the reliability of the gospel tonight, after which we will go to where? Or we'll just, Roses? Okay, excellent. There we go.
Okay.
Grab this.
Oh, yeah. Put that on. All right, yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. It's getting late in the semester. I know everybody's busy. And yeah, we're going to kind of do a mix of a couple different things here, but I think it does tie in reasonably well with our overall series of late, which is focused on Jesus. So we're going to talk about something which I'll define in a minute called undesigned coincidences. And we're going to also look at the resurrection accounts. You've probably heard skeptics complain, and maybe you've been bothered by some of the discrepancies in the gospel accounts. And so we're going to kind of go through some of those. And then next week we have Dr. Rick Townsend, who has his PhD in the history of ideas from UTD and has an interesting background. He's going to do the resurrection talk this year for us, make the case for historical evidence that Jesus did rise from the dead. So excited about that. And then the last regular, well, then we have the student presentations. And then we have Ryan Cruz doing a talk on the Old Testament, sort of reliability of the text. Do we know what we have now is what were originally written with respect to the Old Testament? We hear a lot more about the New Testament, but he kind of specializes in that area as a seminary grad. And actually, Frank Turek wanted that to be filmed because he wants to show that. Ryan has he's on the board for Frank Turek's, not Reasonable Faith, crossexamine.org group. So there's going to be like 2 cameras that day, and we're going to have a pretty professional setup for recording it. So hopefully bring some friends, invite people out for that 29th. I'll be out of town then, as it turns out. But all right, yeah, let's jump in then and give you a little more detail of the outline. We're going to look at this internal evidence. I focused in the past, and most of our other speakers, more on external evidence. We're trying to show that where you can check the Bible, it matches archaeology or historical accounts outside the Bible. But because really, we do have 4 gospel accounts, you can also cross-check them with each other and look at how well do they interconnect and Do they create more problems from that than they solve? And we can discuss that a bit. All right, so yeah, and then we'll look at that. I like this quote by C.S. Lewis. As someone, he really was an expert in the ancient literatures and all that. He was like top-notch scholar who taught at both Cambridge and Oxford. And he says, as a literary historian, I'm perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they're not legends. I've read a great deal of legend, and I'm quite clear they're not the same sort of thing. So I think often, just because you have miracle accounts in the New Testament, people try to think of them in these terms of like, it's got to be myth, it can't be right, there's miracle claims. And yet you have skeptics, atheists often will say, I would believe in God if I saw a miracle. So you shouldn't complain if maybe sometime God did do something miraculous to validate the original message that was brought to people. At least look into it and see if you think the evidence is there, kind of thing. So, all right, the best way I think to look at undesigned coincidences, it's kind of a weird term. I kind of prefer calling it more of like an interlocking way of history. But consider an example from secular history. You might remember in World War II, there was this important Battle of Midway in which a lot of the Japanese carriers were sunk at a really critical early time in the Pacific War. Anyway, just so happens there's an interesting sort of undesigned coincidence there. You have a Japanese diary from a ship where they're recording, hey, there's this person in a small boat that passed by this Japanese ship. And of course, he notes the date and time and everything. But that's all he says. He didn't know anything else. He just thought it was funny that you saw some random little boat out in the middle of the ocean. But we do also have an independent account of an American pilot that records that one of the other planes from his squadron was shot down, and he records it as being in that same vicinity, same time. And then when you throw in the fact that we know, not from that account, but from other accounts, that these pilots almost always had these small life rafts with them so that when they were shot down, they wouldn't drown. So if you put all that together, you kind of get a story like of something plausible that could happen that could explain all the accounts. But any one of them, it doesn't really, there's some unanswered questions, right? And so that's what these undesigned coincidences do often is you look at an independent account and see if it answers questions raised by another account, things like that. Do they interlock? Do they match? Do they have a ring of truth? Now, it is true that just one, a few examples could just be totally coincidence, nothing significant. They got lucky. But these often are very subtle things, and there's so many of them, it's hard to think of them as having been planned and only noticed, centuries later by very careful analysis by people that have access digitally to all the sources and things like that. All right, let's start with an example from the book of Matthew. It says, chapter 14, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. So, of course, Herod had killed John the Baptist because of the daughters asking for that after a dancing thing. But, he was worried that maybe this was coming back, that Jesus was really John the Baptist raised from the dead. But the interesting thing here is, though, you might ask the question, how would Matthew have known what Herod's servants were talking about? That might seem really implausible, right? How could he know that? As a Christian, you could say, well, God somehow revealed it to him or something. But I think even normally the gospel accounts are much more mundane than that. You generally don't think they're having some special revelation from heaven. They're just recording things, and God might be kind of trying to make sure it stays accurate. All right, so he gives no clue. You can read all around there. There's no information in the whole book that would give you any idea how he might know that. But however, Luke, thought to have been written independently of Matthew, and in an entirely different context, he does describe the women associated with Jesus' ministry. So in chapter 8, he says, soon afterwards, he, referring to Jesus, went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. So obviously the last part is really the key there. We see in the book of Luke that actually there were followers of Jesus in Herod's household. And so it's plausible that she could have easily told them something she heard them talking about in Herod's area. So that's an example of one of these kind of undesigned coincidences or interlocking. Again, by itself, maybe not that big a deal, but if you stack together, a whole book of them, I should have brought Hidden in Plain View, which is a whole book written by Lydia McGrew. I brought this today because, though, I have some extra copies. I was actually going to give this book away. It has a chapter on undesigned coincidences. You're the first to raise your hand, and you just got engaged, so there you go. Yeah, it's pretty well done. It's her summary level book that covers a lot of different kinds of evidence, and I know Caitlin's into historical evidence quite a bit, so I think you'll enjoy it. And yeah, there is a chapter of some of these kinds of examples. All right, so let's go to another one here. I like this one a lot. The account of the Last Supper. It's also relevant as we're reflecting on some of the events of the last week of Christ before he was crucified. So in John 13, many of you may remember this is where he is said to have been rising from supper to wash the disciples' feet. So this is an amazing story as sort of the ultimate example of servant leadership. But it's kind of funny if you look at John 13 and read it without looking at any other Gospels, the question arises like, well, it seems kind of odd. Like you're eating dinner and then all of a sudden he rises and he's washing their feet. You would think, okay, they all came in, they walked in from their dusty areas and their sandals. Let's wash their feet at the door. Maybe normally you would do it yourself or have a servant. You wouldn't be like Jesus, this rabbi they're following, do it. But that isn't when he did it. He did it a little bit later in the evening. And why that particular occasion is it recorded? Is there anything significant about that? You don't really know anything to answer those questions from the book of John. However, once again, we can look at the book of Luke and get some insight. However, in Luke, there's no mention of the foot washing. So these don't really seem to be like coordinated kinds of things where they're trying to work together to concoct something where you would have these things fit together. But in Luke 22, at this particular time frame, it talks about how there was a dispute that arose among them as to which of them would be regarded as the greatest. And Jesus ends up saying, for who is the greater, one who reclines at the table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. All right, so Jesus is talking about how he's serving them, but it doesn't mention the foot washing. And they were having this dispute amongst themselves about who is the greatest. Okay, so you could see why, if they're talking about this at dinner, Jesus might just kind of be fed up. He's like, okay, I'm going to try to teach you guys an object lesson. Let's do this foot washing thing right then and there. Those two stories really fit together well when you put them together. And that's the kind of thing that true history often does. You'll have some kind of dangling questions from just reading one account. But when you put it together, if it lines up and there's some implied thing that could have happened that would explain both, it really makes you think, oh, this at least seems plausible, it seems credible. And so if you do that enough, if you have a book worth of examples just on how the Gospels fit together, it does combine to form, I think, part of the evidence that would help you think, yeah, this could be really reliable information. And so we need to take these accounts seriously and what they're claiming. So Luke is indirectly revealing why Jesus washed their feet and at that particular time. And John never mentioned the words, but he mentions the activity and vice versa. All right, and yet another one. I think I have mentioned this a couple of years ago here, but in the feeding of the 5,000, there's several interesting interlocking. This is the only miracle, well, you could say other than the resurrection, that's recorded in all 4 Gospels that Jesus did. So this was like an important thing, apparently, that all 4 Gospel authors chose to want to include in their accounts. And so we can look, we have more information here if we're kind of comparing how they fit together. Now sometimes Tim McGrew, when he's talking about this, even before he talks about what story, he likes to say, hey, let's suppose that we're making up a story. We want to try to make it sound realistic, of the kind, supposedly for the skeptics, they think these gospel authors made up accounts, that they wrote down as what Jesus did. They sort of think a lot of it might have been made up. How hard would it be to make up a plausible account? And so he says, okay, you're making up a story involving food and money. Which disciple would you have Jesus interact with? So any thoughts on that and why? Rob?
Judas was the one who handled the money, right?
That's right. He was the treasurer. That's a really, really good example. Yeah.
Matthew's job was literally to deal with money before joining Jesus.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. And then, the other options might be, well, what about, one of the big ones like Peter or James or John, sort of the inner circle. They're mentioned a lot in the other stories. But in this particular case, Jesus turns to Philip, who he's a disciple, but he doesn't get a lot of airtime in the Gospels, you could say. And he says, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so these people may eat? Doesn't say why he asked Philip. It doesn't give really any details, background that would explain that. No clue from John alone. However, in Luke's account, it doesn't mention Philip in this story, but it does at least tell you where the miracle happened. He records it as having occurred sort of fairly near the city of Bethsaida. Okay, so again, that doesn't help us so far, but you'll see where this is headed in a minute. Because if you go to earlier in John, he does mention that Philip was from Bethsaida. Okay, so basically what you have here is Jesus is saying, Philip, you're from around here. Where would we go to get a bunch of food for these people? So there's a logical reason why he would turn to particularly Philip amongst the disciples to ask that kind of question. Because he knows he's going to do the miracle, and he's sort of just kind of asking them to see what they'll say, to see if they really thought through this. Because, yeah, they really couldn't find enough food if they tried in this small area for so many people. All right, but there's a lot more. There's several other interesting things about this story as well. All right, so you see in the book of Mark where it talks about this, it says, Jesus said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Okay, so there's a couple questions that arise here. Why were many coming and going? If you read that whole Mark account about the feeding of the 5,000, there's no information that might tell you why was there a bunch of people traveling around at this particular time. It does also mention another sort of detail that, especially for us, it's easy to gloss over. It says they sat down in green grass. Okay, no big deal. You would expect that, right? Well, actually, you probably wouldn't in this area of Palestine. It's actually, most of the year, it's pretty dry. I don't know if y'all have been there or checked it. I even checked I use this WeatherSpark website a lot for my travels to look at rain levels in different times of the year. And sure enough, in this area near the Sea of Galilee, it's really dry for about 7 or 8 months of the year. But April is probably like the greenest time of the year because you get a lot of rain in the sort of the late winter and early spring, and you've got more sunshine then. So that would be a time where the grass would be green, even though it normally isn't. It's a small detail, maybe one that's easily to have gotten right by accident. But in John, we do have the information, that it was in the Passover time. So that relates to the grass. I should have made that a little bit more clear, the timing of when they would have green grass. But it also then explains the question of why many were coming and going. Because at Passover, as you remember from Acts, a lot of people came in to, that was for a different thing 40 days later, but often the Jews that lived the Jews were very scattered, right? A lot of them were living in other parts of the Mediterranean world, and they would come back for these feasts or festivals. And especially for Passover, many would come back. Josephus records there could have been, in some cases, hundreds of thousands coming back for Passover. So that one thing, once you mention the time in the book of John, that explains information in the book of Mark about coming and going and the green grass. And so that there's this kind of interlocking with respect to that as well on the story. Yeah, there's actually a place where he records 3 million Jews. Some scholars think he might have been exaggerating on the exact number, but it was a lot. So here is the book that, if you really want to dig deep, that I would most recommend, Hidden in Plain View, where literally the whole book is just going through a bunch of these kinds of undesigned coincidences. And they do it. She's focused more on the New Testament here, but it extends not just in the Gospels, but also like in the book of Acts, as well as the Pauline letters. You see a number of things there also.
Can I say real quick?
Yeah.
One thing that J. Warner Wallace has suggested to people as a heuristic in reading documents of antiquity, no matter what they are, as an apologist,
Hello.
Is never miss an adjective or never ignore an adjective, because they're almost always somebody who's fabricating something or somebody who remembers poorly is going to provide as simple of an account as possible. So each adjective or adverb that's unnecessary to what's actually happening can carry a lot of extra ancillary information. So like in the introduction to the Gospel of Luke, there's the word orderly. It seemed good to me also to write an orderly account. He sort of suggests he's actually differentiating himself from the Gospel of Mark, saying we're not collaborating too much on this, which lends further credence to Luke's account of things. So that's just another example of adjectives having value for undesigned coincidences and then just reliability in general.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. It's a really good point. Yeah, it's thought that parts of Mark are more topical than chronological. And Luke was trying to be more orderly in general. All right, yeah, any other questions or comments about undesigned coincidences? I have more of the time in this talk really devoted to some of the resurrection discrepancies. But I wanted to at least kind of give an intro to some of these and encourage y'all to check it out, study more. You can Google, if you go to YouTube and put in like McGrew, undesigned coincidences, you'll see a bunch from Tim or Lydia McGrew that are pretty good, some of them in very short form, very digestible form. I do have one between history, like an external, from Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, and the book of Matthew that I want to share as well. But that was the end of the ones I had related to different gospel connections. So yeah, this one relates, there's 2 things here to highlight. One is well, it kind of goes along with what you were just saying, Kenneth. If you look carefully, here you don't really see it in the English, but if you look at the Greek of Matthew 2:22, it says not that Archelaus was king, but that he was reigning as king. There's literally, it's almost like kinging. So there's some implication here of something being a little bit unusual about how that was going down. And in Josephus's Antiquities, we find out that actually Archelaus had laid claim to the throne, but it wasn't yet certified by Caesar. And so he actually got in kind of some hot water about that because he took the kingship before Caesar had granted it. So that fits really well with that little detail. But this is one that I learned from Tim McGrew that I thought was really interesting to me. And that is that, okay, so in Matthew 2:22, it talks about Joseph, the father of Jesus. He had heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod. He was afraid to go there, being warned in a dream. He withdrew to the district of Galilee. So they had been going to Egypt. They fled because they were killing all the babies of Bethlehem, you might remember. So when they're coming back, you have this brief mention of like, oh, they're not really going back to Judea, Bethlehem area. They're going to go up to the district of Galilee because Jesus was raised more in Nazareth. But because Joseph was from Bethlehem, even though they had traveled there, it seemed like they were maybe heading back to just Judea, the southern part of Palestine. So the question arises like, okay, well, he probably would have known that Archelaus, being the eldest son of Herod Antipas, that he would be the one to take over. So why is he so surprised? Why does he have this sudden change to go further north than he originally planned? Well, it doesn't say in Matthew 2. All right, so it's Herod the Great, not Herod Antipas. I messed that up. But why does this news cause Joseph to change his plans and to go into Galilee? We have no information from Matthew about that, but we do from Josephus. So Herod the Great had died, and Archelaus had taken his place just before March of 4 BC, when the Jews made the Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem. All right, so we know this had just gone down, that you had this replacement of Archelaus taken over, and you had a particular incident that was very significant. So just before there was this Passover feast, there was a deadly clash between some angry Jews in the temple and Roman soldiers, and it ended up that the Jews killed some of the soldiers in the temple. And I guess Archelaus, in his new role, he wanted to lay down the hammer and really show that you don't mess around with his rule. Don't go against these Roman soldiers. So he sent a troop of armed horsemen to surround the temple, and they had orders not to let anyone out, and they ended up slaughtering 3,000 of them. And basically they just closed it down. There was no ability to celebrate Passover. So you have all these pilgrims coming in, and then there's no Passover. They need to just go home. So they would be returning to their various areas. And we happen to know that many Jews lived in Egypt. Many would have been going back. So you have Joseph with the baby, or 2-year-old Jesus or whatever, coming north to go back home. And then you have the pilgrims going, some of them, and they were going all different directions, right? But some of them would be going back to Egypt. And so they see them on the way, and they would communicate this story that, hey, he'd be like, why are you guys leaving? We haven't finished all the Passover celebrations or things that go on for that week. And they would be telling him, well, look, there was this major problem. They killed 3,000 people, and they didn't let us finish our Passover celebration. And so encountering those pilgrims, Joseph logically would not want to just set up shop under this rule. So he, by going to Galilee, we know historically that was a region that was not ruled by Archelaus. And so it seemed safer for him to just go further north and go back to living in that area. So interesting connection among history, but something you don't even get just from the Bible itself. You have to look at Josephus in conjunction with the book of Matthew. All right, so yeah, go ahead, Ashton.
He run back like the detour. So where was Josephus trying to head originally?
Well, not Joseph. Josephus was writing about the fact that. Joseph.
Joseph the father. Yeah, where was he trying to go originally?
He was trying to go to Judea. He was going back. I don't know for sure. It was somewhere, maybe at Bethlehem, since he had relatives there. But he was going to Judea at least. And then when he gets going toward there, and then he's like, oh, I'm going to go to Galilee instead. So.
And Galilee, that's south of Judea? Or?
Galilee's north of Judea.
Is north, so he went farther north than he
Yeah. He had to get out of the area that was reign. I should have a map in here maybe. The reign of Archelaus extended just in the southern part. So if you go back to Judea, you're in his reign. If you go to Galilee, not sure who's reigning there, but I know that it's not Archelaus. That's the key point.
Okay, and then Josephus qualifies what Matthew says because he says that Archelaus
He gives the whole detail about Passover being canceled, 3,000 Jews being killed. He shows that very early in the reign of Archelaus revealed that he was this homicidal maniac dictator, and that would be why Joseph is afraid to go there, and he ends up changing his plans. So, all right, yeah, we're going to switch gears here then to looking at some of the so-called contradictions, or we can definitely call them discrepancies, some differences in the gospel accounts for those portions that relate to the resurrection or anything in that whole account that's close to it. See how we're doing on time here. Yes. A lot of these slides in blue are really, these are kind of just taken from Tim McGrew. I modified them some. So just I'd give him credit for that, especially since I was filling in. I didn't feel too bad about doing that. But yeah, it's something I have studied in some detail as well. And I just thought he was really good at giving some of the explanations. So yeah, he starts off, he wants to kind of point out this proverb, which I think is very applicable to a lot of apologetics areas. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And so that's why, as Christians who are trying to look at the intellectual side of Christianity, we want to look at what the skeptics are saying. We want to look at the challenges and not just ignore them. We could be wrong about some things. I might think certain arguments for the existence of God are good until I find out something and it's like, oh, can't use that one. But I still have maybe other ones. I could still have a reasonable faith, even if some of my things I originally thought turned out to be incorrect. We should always have an open mind in investigation. So one of the things that you encounter that's sort of from the other side here is that you'll have very outspoken critics like Bart Ehrman, who is very educated. He's very sharp, studied at Princeton under Bruce Metzger. His area of specialty is more in textual criticism, looking at the ancient documents and how close it matches. But he's kind of delved into a lot of different areas and spoken as though he's an expert in all these. But he agrees with this principle, as you can see from that quote. But he's an interesting character because he is a former Christian. And so he gets a lot of airtime, and he really likes to focus on that. He was sort of a fundamentalist. He had more of that background, which to me, he still seems like a fundamentalist. He's having a very fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, taking things wooden literally instead of looking at what's the intent of the authors and things like that. But he was a high school debate champion. He's a sharp guy. He's a good rhetorician. So he's someone to be kind of reckoned with. But you'll have someone like him, and he has probably led to more people losing their faith than anyone else, from what I can tell. Richard Dawkins probably has had some influence toward that as well. But really, what I found, more people lose their faith by reading Bart Ehrman, which is very unfortunate because I think his arguments are actually very weak upon thorough examination. So I think it's worth sort of cross-examining his claims against what we find in the scriptures. And Tim McGrew is one of the best at doing that. He has debated Ehrman on Unbelievable podcast in the UK. You can catch some of those. And I think did a good job. All right, so you'll find, Bart saying the sources are hopelessly contradictory, as we can see by doing a detailed comparison of the accounts in the Gospels. And he'll complain about the angels at the tomb, the discrepancies there, by saying, on the third day after Jesus' death, the women go to the tomb to anoint his body for burial. And whom do they see there? Do they see a man, as Mark says, or two men, Luke, or an angel, Matthew? And he often likes to say phrases like, it depends on which gospel you read, whether you have A or B or C or whatever. He really tries to highlight the discrepancies. But, I mean, you could obviously just say, well, look, it could be two angels who look like men. It is true that throughout the whole Bible, basically, it's very common that when angels appear to men, they look like men in most cases. And you even have verses like in Hebrews that people have entertained angels unaware. You have Abraham entertaining these people that he just thought were men, but we know from the text they're angels. So that doesn't seem like that much of a stretch. And then when you also factor in that sometimes you might, if you're an ancient author and just recording some things, are you always obligated to list like everybody was there, how many were there, and things like that? Is it okay to just say, hey, there was this angel there, he was saying X, Y, Z, without mentioning the other angel? It's not that big of a deal. And Bart himself will admit, like, okay, you could say that, and that would explain everything else. Why Matthew says they saw an angel. He mentions one of the two, but he doesn't deny there was a second. Why Mark says it was a man. The angels appeared to be men, even though they were angels. And Mark mentions only one of them without denying there was a second. And why Luke says it was two men, since the angels appeared to be men. So he even admits, like, okay, yeah, you could say that. But he also pushes back against that kind of harmonization of the Gospels. And he says the problem is that this kind of reconciling, again, requires one to assert that what really happened is unlike any of the Gospels say, since none of the three accounts state that the women saw two angels. All right, so he really wants to try to make a big deal out of this, even though he sees a possible resolution. But the key question is, well, what do you mean by unlike when you say what really happened is unlike what the Gospel said? Okay, so here, if his claim is that none of the Gospel accounts is by itself identical with this reconstruction, then it doesn't matter. I mean, that's very common in eyewitness testimony. Kenneth mentioned a while ago, J. Warner Wallace, the famous cold case homicide detective who became a Christian at age 35, from an atheist background, he's a really good one to kind of discuss this because he deals a lot with eyewitness testimony and trying to analyze it. And his kind of cases are ones which were cold. Like sometimes he'll try to solve a murder that's 30 years old. Sometimes you're dealing with written works of eyewitness testimony that were done years ago. So it's kind of like, I mean, it's not as many years, obviously, but it's kind of similar to what you have with evaluating the Gospels. And what he likes to highlight, and I mentioned this later in the slides, I'm maybe getting ahead of myself, but is that in all his experience, he always expects some discrepancies in eyewitness reports. Unless they were just colluding and making up a story, if it was some kind of conspiracy, yeah, they would agree. But otherwise, he argues, like, you always have differences, just the nature of human observation and what people choose to tell. All right, so, okay, so yeah, getting back to this rejoinder to Bart, if you want to say the word unlike is that these things are contradicting each other, then obviously that's not true. So either way, his claim that there's this big problem just evaporates if you really kind of think about the significance of it, and especially when you start layering in expectations of the degree to which you expect them to say the same things. But Bart will say, like, look, in order to resolve the tension between the Gospels, the interpreter has to write his own Gospel, which is unlike any of the Gospels found in the New Testament, and isn't a bit absurd to say, in effect, that only my Gospel, the one I create from parts of the four in the New Testament, is the right one, and that the others are only partially right. I mean, that's a pretty clever way, I think, of phrasing it, because you're trying to say, like, look, you have to make up this Gospel to explain the other ones. But when you think about what really happens with any kind of eyewitness testimony, and you're getting partial information from each one of them, you always have that kind of thing going on. And it's your goal as a detective or a historian or whatever to try to analyze that and see if is there a coherent underpinning story that matches the accounts. And you can always ask the question, yeah, are your witnesses lying? Do they have motive to lie? Things like that, sure. But I think looking for ways in which they could all agree is part of just being a good historian. So again, Magruder wants to push back from this claim like partially right. He would rather say the gospel accounts are simply partial. Yeah, they're all incomplete. Instead of what Ehrman claims, where he's claiming they're positively asserting falsehoods. But if you look at the Gospels themselves, like in John 20, near the end there, he says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. So he's claiming to have a very partial record of what Jesus did. He's explicitly saying, like, hey, I'm not telling you most of what happened. It's a subset. All right? Okay, what about the women at the tomb? So this gets a lot of airtime. Who actually went to the tomb? Was it Mary alone, as in John 20, verse 1? Mary and another Mary, as we have in Matthew 28? Or in Mark 16, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome? Or the women who had accompanied Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, possibly Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women from Luke 24. So he does a nice job of summarizing what each of the Gospels say there and listing what it says with respect to what women were there. Okay? So yeah, that could be a little bit surprising maybe if you were expecting each author to list all the people that were there. But is that a valid expectation? Yes, sir.
For Luke, it certainly was. Women were seen as, I think, that's why there's a lot of stories the woman had that wasn't recorded in the other Gospels were Jewish authors. It was only by Luke. Who
Yeah.
actually talked to the woman and got their side of the story.
That's a very good observation. Yeah, Luke has a lot more recorded about women than do the other Gospels. And yeah, that's a very good thought. So yeah, that might be why he listed more of them. He might have talked to more of them, interviewed people that interviewed them. We don't know all the details of how he got the testimony, but let's start then by looking at John, where John only mentions Mary. But does John's account claim that it was Mary alone? He does not say it was Mary alone, but you could still be bothered a little bit, maybe by the fact that he only mentions Mary. I would claim that you shouldn't. But once you get to verse 2, the one after the verse that he quotes from, you see already that Mary says to Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. So he's using this we. So he's admitting right there that Mary was not alone, because when he quotes from her, she uses the word we, which she would not use if she was alone. It's pretty obvious. Yes?
Is it possible that she would have been referring to herself and other members of a group not present? Like if I'm talking about reasonable faith to one of my friends, I might say, oh yeah, we have this running joke with rubber ducks, even though I would be the only one there.
I mean, I think here it seems to be talking, she's giving an account just when she gets back to them, and it's hard to see how she would not be referring to the fact that other people were with her when she was at the tomb. You can't rule it out 100% maybe, but in the context, it's like it's just right there when she first gets to Peter. She's talking about what's going on. Hey, we don't know what where they took him, but he wasn't there.
Also, it does assume that the we is inclusive of all the disciples. And so she's speaking on behalf of Peter here. It's like, or she's like speaking on behalf of like whoever she's talking. So like she's talking to Peter. It would sound like she's speaking on behalf of Philip, Bartholomew, all the others, even though they're not aware of what Mary just witnessed. So the we does imply that most people did see the empty tomb.
That's a better way to put it. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's really not, it seems almost disingenuous to me for Ehrman to claim, at least with respect to John, that it was Mary alone when she says we. All right, but what about the other Gospels? Look a little bit deeper there, because that's the thing you want to do when you get claims like that. It could sound bothersome coming from a scholar and he's laying these things out. Go back and look carefully at the text. In all cases, is the thing to do. All right, so Mark lists several, or Matthew lists Mary and another Mary, and Mark lists these various, two Marys and Salome. What about that? Again, neither one is claiming to have a complete list. If we talked about who went the other night to the pancakes and proposals, you're talking about what's going on there to friends. You might mention some of the people that were there, and you might have a reason for mentioning them because of something they said or did. In no sense should people interpret that as like a complete list of everybody that was there. Apparently there was quite a few women that went there. Why think that they should necessarily list all of them? So I think even as we interact with each other in modern times, you're often dealing with, incomplete lists in telling stories. However, again, there's something even more helpful in showing that this is not really a problem in the text. Because Luke admits basically by saying other women when he's giving the list that it is an incomplete list. So he certainly is not trying to list everybody, and he's explicit about that. And John is implicit about it by using we. So yeah, you still don't have anything real explicit in Matthew or Mark, but you could easily have reasons like if, say for the case of Mark, he wasn't one of the disciples. He's getting a lot of his information from Peter. Sometimes you may not know everybody that was there either. You're just like recording like, hey, I have this information from an eyewitness that so-and-so is there and so-and-so. You don't know the full list. You just record what you know. Nothing wrong about doing that kind of thing in other contexts, so why should it be a problem here? So difference is not disagreement. Two accounts do not need to be identical for them to both be true. That's pretty obvious. And here's where I mentioned I was getting ahead of myself about J. Warner Wallace. He said, as a skeptic, that was one of the things that did not bother him at all when he read the Gospels, that he saw these differences. And he, in fact, argues that it was a strength because he would have been more suspicious if there was closer levels of agreement because he's so used to analyzing eyewitness testimony, seeing some differences, that it led him to think that this seemed like about the right level of sort of differences that you shouldn't necessarily view as contradictions. Now, the thing I've reflected on a lot is the fact that it's kind of anachronistic for us in our modern era to expect this kind of incredible precision from ancient writings. Because we live in an era, right, where you're just typing in on the computer and you've got a word processor. It's really quick, inexpensive to write. And if you want to get the information out, you just click send on the email or text or whatever, right? No big deal. But think about what was really going on in the first century. You're paying a lot of money to get something to write with and to write on. It takes time. And then if you want to copy it and disseminate the information, brevity also becomes very important because the more you write, that's a lot more to get out to other people. And then when you factor in that they were usually writing on scrolls, the codices book kind of stuff came a little bit later. And a lot of scholars, for example, think that when Matthew was writing, it's so long, if you look at the number of words, they think he might have been getting close to the end of a scroll. And so you have an extra reason at the end here to kind of be brief. It's like he's got to make it fit. So I find that kind of interesting as well. But the main point is that you have all the more reason to sometimes be brief and not even take the, do you want to take the words to say, this is not a complete list of all the women who were there. That doesn't seem that important to an ancient audience. You're just listing some examples that you maybe think people would know or something like that. Did you have a comment? Or?
I just wanted to note that I noticed that Mark and Luke separate the buying the spices 2 days before to embalm Jesus and those who actually attended the tomb on the Sunday morning, reducing it from listing the women who were there to simply saying they, or actually not saying anything at all because there's no pronoun for they.
Okay.
It's used in there.
Yeah.
It's just a congregation. So it's actually, it seems very plausible to me that people could have bought spices who didn't end up using them because there was less of a need for everybody who bought them to be there to embalm him. So
yeah.
There's a lot of good explanations.
Yeah. To make it, it's one thing to say like, okay, I'm surprised there's maybe more discrepancies than you would think, which I think that would be a weak argument too. But Ehrman, he's overplaying his hand here to the degree that I think it undermines his credibility, especially when you look at other examples. There's just so many where he makes these claims, and then you go look at the text, and they just do not hold up. All right, so yeah, I think if you really think about the brevity that would be needed for ancient writing, it makes this even more of like, hey, I don't really see a problem here. And really, this kind of harmonization that's going on with the Gospels, we do that all the time in secular history. People are looking for ways to see if two accounts can fit together. It's just part of like being a historian. So Tim McGrew shares this interesting example. Let's suppose you're trying to answer the question just in secular history of who made the public proclamation of the Declaration of Independence from the balcony of the old State House in Boston on the morning of July 18th, 1776. All right, that's kind of a big deal. The first public proclamation of this Declaration of Independence in this key city. So the interesting thing here is we do have some discrepancies. Some early sources say it was William Lingrief, High Sheriff of Suffolk County, but other sources say it was Colonel Thomas Crafts. Okay, so that's kind of weird though, like this is not going back that far. And this seems to be more of a direct contradiction, right? How can you have both of them being the ones proclaiming it? So that seems more bothersome, right? Okay, but actually it turns out if you do enough digging, you find out what really happened. And in a sense, both were true. It turned out that Greenleaf had a weak voice And so the crowd could not hear him. Again, putting yourself in that era, they didn't have microphones, project the sound. It's a little bit different. So you might be the official that has the authority to make some comment on it. I don't have a very strong voice myself, so I can kind of understand that. But some people have this booming voice. So what would happen is Greenleaf would say something, and then Crafts would repeat it after him sentence by sentence, loudly enough for all to hear. So once you learn that from reporting of the time, you realize it's not really, that's also not a problematic discrepancy. There's an underlying explanation for that. And so you have to keep that kind of thing in mind when you're looking at testimonies, historical testimonies. So in the legal view, even, McGrew quotes some people here talking about how partial variance in testimony of different witnesses on minute and collateral points, although they frequently afford the adverse advocate a topic for copious observation. In other words, like, and J. Warner Wallace talks about this too, like if there are discrepancies in the eyewitness reports, the defense attorney, he's going to try to really make a big deal about that, right? But Jim Wallace, he'll deal with the jury and try to show them that, it's really not a problem. Anyway, I won't read that whole quote because it's kind of long, and this is probably the more important part of it by Thomas Starkey here. It so rarely happens that witnesses of the same transaction perfectly and entirely agree in all points connected with it, that an entire and complete coincidence in every particular, so far from strengthening their credit, not infrequently engenders a suspicion of practice in concert. So yeah, it could look too rigged if it's too similar. That's the principle that Jim Wallace was also concerned about. All right, I think we have time to cover this one as well here, and maybe even the next one. Okay, so at the end of Mark, and Ehrman says that this is irreconcilable. In Mark's account, the women are instructed to tell the disciples to go meet Jesus in Galilee, but out of fear, they don't say a word to anyone about it. Okay, so the end of the part of Mark that we think was in the original writing for sure, it says they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In each of the three Gospels, the women tell the disciples what happened. But in Mark, you don't really get that far. And so Bart wants to read that as a contradiction. But is that the right reading of Mark? There's a couple problems with that. As some of you guys may know from Ryan Crew's previous presentation, the long ending of Mark is one of the two main areas that were not in the original text in terms of extended passages. The other one being the story about the adulterous woman and Jesus writing in the sand. So nearly all scholars of all stripes agree that Mark 16, 9 through 20 was not part of the original text. It was added somewhat later. And so in most Bibles, it's very obvious. You'll see italics there as like this was added later. And that's where they have like the snakes and all that the snake handlers point to. So we're kind of okay with, yeah, but that wasn't necessarily part of the original text there. But the other parts of that are fine. But so, yeah, there's some disagreement. But, I mean, yeah, the key question is, was Mark 16:8 the actual ending, or did we just lose, maybe it was the last part of the scroll and we lost that in some of the early copies. People weren't able to propagate that. It's plausible, especially because sometimes those scrolls would get eaten by, mice or different things, so bugs. So interestingly, Ehrman's dissertation director, Bruce Metzger, was one of those that thought, we probably are just missing the original ending to Mark. And McGrew points out that in all these other places in Mark, you see things where like Jesus is saying he allowed no one to follow him, but then later it says except Peter and James and John, or they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. You see in Mark several examples of people being told not to say something, but they do, or things like that. So it's at least not that unreasonable to think that there was something like this in the original ending, They told no one, for they were afraid, but running to the disciples, they told them all that they had seen and heard. And that's basically what you get in Matthew 28. So I would say at a minimum, just the fact that we don't know whether that was the original ending of Mark, we should be cautious about assuming that there wasn't something that even addressed the women talking to the disciples in that. It's also implausible to think that they made it up, the women being the first eyewitness testimonies of the empty tomb, because as was pointed out in that culture, among the Jews, women were not highly regarded, especially with respect to testimony in court and things like that. And so it's unlikely they would make that up. If they were making up the story, it would be like the disciples went and discovered the empty tomb, and they're the heroes and all that. So, yeah, I think that collapses under inspection as well. But here's another interesting one that I haven't heard talked about as much that I think is pretty interesting. So some people will read the book of John as saying the crucifixion was on a different day than you get in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, so Mark 14, it says on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, the disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And then the Last Supper follows. But in John 19, he says, in describing the scene where Jesus is condemned to be crucified, now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. All right? So in Mark, the Last Supper takes place on the first day of Passover. Jesus is arrested that night and crucified on the next day, the first day, as Jews reckon, days of Passover. According to Ehrman, John tells us the crucifixion took place on the day of preparation for Passover, the day before Passover. All right? But John does not actually say that it was the day of preparation for Passover. He says it was the day of preparation of Passover. And that's a subtle but important difference, because preparation, you often hear Jews talking about, even today, preparing for the Sabbath because they can't go out and buy food, they can't travel around far. They're getting ready the day before. So preparation day often had that sort of connotation. All right, so in Mark 15 here, Mark uses the same term. He tells us what it means. When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before Sabbath. So in Mark, he's explicit about saying also that it was the day of preparation. But what he's referring to by preparation is preparing for the Sabbath. Okay? So really, they're in agreement as long as you don't force a reading into John of something he didn't say, which would be that it was like the preparation the day before Passover. But notice, and the Jews were able to do stuff every day but the Sabbath. And so really that sort of day of preparation ahead of time is something you needed on Friday, which would have been Passover. So I hope that's not too confusing. But reading John more closely, in chapter 19, it says, since it was the day of preparation, so the bodies would not remain on the cross of Sabbath, for that Sabbath was the high day, the Jews asked Pilate that the legs might be broken, they might be taken away. So John agrees with Mark that it was the day before Sabbath. So I think there really is no disagreement here on when the crucifixion was. It was on a Friday. Good Friday can rightly be celebrated as the day. And you just have to realize that preparation is really more talked about in the context of preparing for Sabbath when you have to do it the day in advance. Well, what does John mean then when he says for the Sabbath was a high day? It was a particularly special feast day, not just any Sabbath day, but Sabbath in Passover week. So that was really important. So you also, if you look at what's going on in the book of John also, you see that it really fits together with the other Gospels quite well. Because in John 18, it says they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. All right? So doesn't this contradict the claim that Passover had already taken place? Passover, though, is not just one day. It's a week-long festival. Throughout the Gospel of John, the word Passover occurs 8 other times, and each of those 8, it's referring to the festival as a whole, not to the opening meal. So that's an important distinction as well. The Seder, or supper that begins Passover celebration, is not the only ritual meal eaten during Passover. There's another ritual meal, for example, the chagiga, not sure how to say that, but eaten at midday the following day. So if the chief priest had entered Pilate's dwelling and been defiled by so doing, the defilement would expire at sundown. All they would need to do is wash, and they would be ceremonially claimed for the evening meal. Therefore, they must be concerned about some meal other than the evening meal. So their worry here cannot have to do with the initial Seder in Passover. So John's account fits perfectly with Mark's. The concern of the chief priest is not and could not be about Passover Seder, for then their worry would make no sense. The Seder was already over, having eaten the previous evening. They're concerned about some other meal in Passover, probably the chagiga. All right, so, yes, sir. When it talks about them being worried about being defiled that morning, it would have expired at sundown, and so they still could have had an evening Passover meal after sundown, is what McGrew is arguing.
Okay, and so they wouldn't have been defiled anymore because it's the evening?
Well, it expires at sundown, so you could still eat after the sun went down for that meal. So he's saying that that should clue you in that that's probably not talking about the Passover meal, but probably the more important thing is even when John's talking about during the crucifixion itself. Where was that? I guess that was before that. That, you know, they had to take the body down. Here it is, because of the Sabbath. So clearly John, unless you think John just like forgot and he's internally inconsistent, which is a really uncharitable way to read someone when it's just a few verses apart. He seems to clearly know that Jesus died on Friday and they had to get the body down before the Sabbath. And so, yeah, they would have already had the Passover meal, but the chagiga was a little bit later, and that's the point of all this. So it's a little confusing, but a key point is realizing that when it says Passover, there's multiple Passover meals as part of the overall festival, and it's often referred to as this kind of week-long set of things that they're doing as part of Passover week. Yeah?
So it says Jesus said that he would be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. How does that work from Friday to Sunday?
Well, as you probably know, I think here you'd want to point to the fact that the Jewish way of counting any partial day is counted as a whole day. And so as long as you had part of Friday, part of Saturday, and part of Sunday, then that's going to be 3 days by just the way they would tend to do things very consistently. So we've got a lot of examples like that from ancient writings where they always just would count that way. All right, so we are out of time, basically, but go ahead. Yeah. I do not, but Tim McGrew is really strong on that. I have prepared some slides on that somewhere. Let me see if I have them on this even. There's I think I talked about, didn't I talk about that some here when I went over the archaeology stuff? I forget. Quirinius.
Yes, we talked about that, so you can watch back. I'll tell you the date because I was looking at it just before.
Yeah, it was one of the early ones I did on archaeology. I was struggling to remember for sure, but I thought it was because I've also been doing a series at my church, and there's been like a lot of overlap, but not totally. So I think I didn't have it at the church, but I did have it here. Yeah. Yeah, you weren't there that week, but yeah, at least you could catch that online. All right, I guess we'll wrap it up and let everyone go to Rosa's.
Do you think you could share that? I'd love to have that PowerPoint.
Sure. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Al.
Okay, yeah, thanks. and thank Tim McGrew. He did a lot of the scholarly research, and he's a very trusted resource. Every time I cross-check anything he does, it's like always passes with flying colors. That's right. He uses his great chess brain. He has incredible memory for things, and he reads voraciously for so many years. So